Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Climate and Concern, COP26 and Global Public Opinion. I'm James Bell. I'm the Vice President for Global Strategy at the Pew Research Center, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. An event I think you'll find both intriguing, provocative at times, but most importantly, educational, and a way to really get a different perspective than some that we're used to on attitudes and thoughts about climate change and what can be done about it. For those of you who don't know, the Pew Research Center is a nonprofit fact tank that informs public dialogue about issues, attitudes, and developments shaping societies around the globe. Now, we use the term fact tank with purpose in mind. We are nonpartisan, and you may have heard that label applied to other research institutions, but most importantly, we're non-advocacy, meaning we don't take positions and don't make recommendations about policy. Our mission is to inform and to improve understanding through our research. Today, as I mentioned, we're focused on the topic of climate change, and the impetus for the conversation today, in large part, is our brand new study that was released only a few hours ago, which is addressing the topic of climate change and how publics in 17 different countries and territories around the globe are viewing this issue. How do they see it as a personal risk to their own livelihoods and their local communities? How do they view national and international actions to combat climate change? What are they willing to do in their own lives as individuals to help reduce the effects of climate change? And very importantly, what do publics around the globe think about the international community's ability to actually deliver significant positive change in the battle against climate change? Now, the timing of our study, the timing of this webinar are not by accident, by any means. We have the opening of the UN's General Assembly today. Climate change will certainly be on the agenda. And of course, just over the horizon, really not far away at all, is COP26 being hosted by the UK government this year. This is obviously one of the premier forums for the international community to discuss, debate, and hopefully agree on action to address climate change. So we're trying to bring something to the conversation that's happening around us in various forums and institutions by emphasizing the perspective of the public. What do citizens think about this issue, this challenge of climate change? If you're joining us today, I assume that you care about this issue, and I assume you're interested to know about public attitudes. Just so you know, the center is devoting greater resources to this topic, and this is only one piece of the research that we're doing on the issue of climate change and how publics view that issue. You can anticipate other releases later this fall, and especially deep dives into what Americans think about the issue of climate change. I want to stress from a procedural point of view that this event is being recorded. And the good news is that we'll have a recording available on our website as soon as possible after the event. Also, this is an event, a webinar, where we really want to hear from those in the audience. We want to hear your questions and do our best to answer those questions. We always learn as much as we educate in these settings. So please, I invite you to submit questions for our speakers at any time over the next hour. To do so, just use the submission box at the bottom of your screen, and I promise to do my best to get as many questions as possible during the question and answer period. And with that, I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Associate Director for Global Attitudes Research, Jacob Pauster, who will discuss our latest public opinion data related to climate change. Jacob, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeb. Really a pleasure to be here and to share this new data with everyone. Very excited to go through this, new study that we had worked on for many months. So shout out to Jeb, co-authors Moira Fagan and Christine Wong, and the rest of the Pew Research Center for making this work. So next slide, please. So who are the Pew Research Center? As Jeb already mentioned, we're a nonprofit fact tank that informs the public about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. We're a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trusts, which gives us most of our money. And we work to generate a foundation of facts to enrich public dialogue. And we do this through public opinion, demographic research, content analysis. And what you'll see on the next couple screens is mostly from our international work. So next slide, please. So this survey was conducted in the spring of 2021. It was conducted across 17 publics. 16 of those publics were conducted via telephone. As you can see, just over 16,000 respondents for our surveys. And we also had a US survey, which was conducted in February with our American Trends panel, which is a Pew Research Center product, to bring you sort of this data across the countries that we survey. And some of these data points that you'll see, we've also asked in previous years, so we can also analyze trends over time. So if you have any questions about the methodology, please share those in the comment box. But we're really proud of our international methods team and all the work that they do to make sure that we have the highest quality data to really nail down these issues and understand what the public says about this very important issue. Next slide, please. So the general story from the data that we collected is that there is great concern about climate change among many of the people in which we survey. A median of 72% across these 17 publics say that they're concerned that global climate change will harm them personally at some point in their lifetime. And also, people are willing to make changes to the way that they live and work in order to deal with the issue of climate change. A median of 80% across these 17 publics say that. So overall, there's a lot of concern about climate change, and there's also a sense that people are willing to make changes in their lifestyles in order to address it. On the other hand, though, there's a little less confidence in the international community's actions to address climate change. When we ask the question of whether they're confident that actions taken by the international community to significantly reduce the effects of climate change, only 46% say that they're confident, with 52% who are not confident. Still, people are fairly confident in their own society's ability to handle climate change. 56% say that their own society is doing a good job of dealing with climate change versus 44% who say that their own society is doing a bad job. Next slide, please. And we also find that concern about climate change is growing in the minds of many of these publics. We last asked this question in 2015, and those who say that they're very concerned that global climate change will harm them personally at some point in their lifetime has grown 19 percentage points in Germany since 2015, from 18% to 37% today. It's gone up 18 percentage points in the UK, which is obviously the host of COP26. It's up in Australia, South Korea, Spain, Canada, France. It's actually down. Personal concern is actually down in Japan, but for the most part, over the last 6 years, we've seen a general trend of more concern about climate change on a personal level. And Pew Research Center has also gathered data on threats worldwide. And we see a corresponding increase in those who say that global climate change is a threat to their country as well. So overall, this pattern of a growing concern, growing sense of threat from climate change is pretty clear from the publics that we survey. And keep in mind, this was before a lot of the extreme weather that we saw over the summer, because the survey was done in the March-May period of this year. So, we're interested in going back into the field and tracking these data points again and to see what happened in the future. Next slide, please. One very interesting finding from this data is that young people are more concerned about that global climate change will harm them personally at some point in their lifetime than are those who are in older age brackets. So, for example, in Sweden, home to a very well-known climate activist, 65% of 18 to 29-year-olds say that they're concerned that they will be personally harmed by climate change over their lifetimes versus 25% among those who are 65 plus. And we see these sort of age gaps appear in many of the publics that we survey, although the reverse finding is in Greece and South Korea. But overall, the general sense of the data is that young people are more concerned about climate change. And they say this in a lot of ways. It's not just that they're more personally concerned, they're also willing to make more lifestyle changes, and they're also more likely to say that global climate change is an international threat. So young people are really the ones who are more concerned about this. To a lesser extent, women are more concerned than men in many of the countries, and those who are more educated are more willing to make lifestyle changes as well. So there are some other demographic gaps, but the age one is the one that really sticks out in the data. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's not as much confidence in the international community to deal with climate change. Overall, 46% say that they're confident versus 52% who are not. But this does diverge by country. So for example, in France, Sweden, Belgium, New Zealand, majorities are actually not confident in the international community to deal with climate change. But in places like Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, and Singapore, there are majorities confident. So there is a mixed bag on this one question. Like, for example, in the US, predominantly not confident, but it's fairly close, 54-45. But overall, I wouldn't say there's an overwhelming amount of confidence in the international community to deal with climate change. And that's pretty clear in our data that we show here. Next slide, please. But we also find that there's not a lot of sense that actions to reduce climate change will necessarily benefit the economies within these survey publics. At the same time, there's not a big sense that it will actually harm the economies of these publics. For the most part, a lot of people say that actions to reduce climate change by the international community will have no impact on their economies. And in some countries, like Sweden and South Korea and Italy, pluralities say that it will actually benefit their economies. At the same time, up to a third in many of the publics that we survey say that actions to reduce climate change will actually hurt their economy, including a third in the United States. So this is one area where it's not necessarily clear that the actions taken to deal with climate change will be an ultimate benefit to society when we put it in this very stark choice for the economies in these publics. Next slide, please. We also see an ideological divide throughout on many of these questions. And this is, we place people on an ideological scale based on where they place themselves on the spectrum, whether on the left or on the right. And on this question on whether actions to reduce climate change will benefit the economy, those on the left are far more willing to say that these actions will actually help the economy versus those on the right, who are much more likely to say that actions to reduce emissions will actually hurt the economy. And this is especially true in the United States. We've seen in a lot of our data that the partisan differences in the United States are much larger than in a lot of the other publics that we survey. And this is true here, where 53% of those on the left in the US say that actions to reduce emissions will benefit our economy versus only 12% among those on the right. But we also see that those on the left are more personally concerned about climate change, more willing to make lifestyle changes. And on the other hand, those on the right are actually more positive on their own society's actions to deal with climate change and also the United States actions in dealing with climate change around the world. Next slide, please. And when it comes to international organizations and countries and they're dealing with climate change, we also see a mixed bag. On the one hand, there's a lot of confidence, a lot of positive views towards the EU's handling of climate change. 63% of medians say that they're doing a good job of dealing with global climate change. 56% say the same about the UN. That they're doing a good job of dealing with climate change versus only 39% who say that they're doing a bad job. And 56% say that their own society is doing a good job of dealing with climate change. But when you look at the two largest global emitters with the United States and China, there's generally negative ratings for those two countries. Only 36% say that the US is doing a good job of dealing with climate change versus 61% who say that they're doing a bad job. And 78%, a median across these 17 publics, say that China is doing a bad job of dealing with climate change. And that's, obviously these two countries are important elements of any kind of plan to deal with global climate change. And that publics have sort of negative views of their actions so far, I think speaks volumes. Next slide, please. When you nail down to the specifics of how countries think about the EU and the UN dealing with climate change, the EU generally gets positive remarks marks from almost every public that we survey. The UN is a bit more spaced out. For example, only 36% in Germany say they're doing a good job versus 69% in Singapore who say the same. But overall, there's a general sense that the UN is doing a good job of dealing with climate change. Next slide, please. And then when you look at their own societies, there's also a big gap between countries. For the most part, people are positive on how their countries are dealing with climate change, but this is especially true in Sweden, the UK, Singapore, and New Zealand. On the other hand, about half in the US, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan say that their republics are not doing a good job of dealing with climate change. Next slide, please. And finally, when you look at the individual data on the US and China, you see that there's a range of highlights, but you see that the marks for China are pretty low across the board. Only 7% in South Korea, only 10% in Germany and Japan say that China is doing a good job. And for the US as well, it's fairly low, but a bit more breadth of results, with Germany, again, being sort of at the bottom here, only 20% of Germans saying that the US is doing a good job of dealing with climate change versus 53% in Singapore who say the same. So next slide, please. So that's the bulk of the data. Obviously, for more information on the survey itself, on more charts and tables and results from this really exciting survey, please visit our website. There's a lot of data here. I obviously couldn't pack it all in to this one presentation, but certainly feel free to follow us, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And with that, I will swing it back to Jeb for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Jacob. A lot to digest there, obviously, as you said, and I really appreciate the teamwork on this project. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is something really important to the center that we continue to research this issue. Before I turn to our commentators, I just want to remind our participants today that, again, you can submit questions at any time. You can do that by using the submission box at the bottom of your screen, and I please do encourage you to do so. And now it's my privilege to introduce Nick Bridge. He's a special representative for climate change of the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Previous to holding that position, he was a permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the OECD. That was from 2011 to 2016. He also served as chief economist at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the head of the Global Economy Department. And in addition, for more than a decade, he held diplomatic postings in countries including China, Japan, and the United States. Nick, many thanks for joining us today. You're in a unique position to bring the perspective of someone who's very attuned to the international discussions about climate change. But just to start you off, when you digest some of these findings, what strikes you as most relevant to the job you have today and the task ahead of COP26?
I was just having trouble getting off mute, one of those problems of the last couple of years. Thank you so much, James and Jacob and everybody behind the scenes making this event happen and for all the work. But well, thank you for the data, I suppose is the first thing. It's no surprise that those who have that data, the scientists, the policymakers, the economists, have for a long time known the extent of the challenge, but also been at the forefront of understanding the opportunities. And I think I'll come back again and again to that balance of understanding the scale of the risks that we face, that we have to get across. This is not doom mongering or worrying people. It's just a proper risk assessment into world leaders and their people, and then the positive stories around change and what we can deliver. So I think the data, intuitively, obviously makes a lot of sense. Two big things: concern is going up, and that's because our scientific understanding is elaborating all the time, and we are hearing, and seeing, absolutely shocking events all over the world that are now baked in. We have about 1.5 degrees of warming already on land mass. 1.2 roughly across the world as a whole. We have shocking multiples of that at the polar regions, which are so central to the Earth systems more generally. And I could go on for a long time about all the absolutely extraordinary signals that we're seeing in our weather systems, and already reaching unlivable temperatures, literally unlivable temperatures in some parts of the world for small periods of time now. And we know that the stock of all of that, the flows will build whatever we do, however successful we are at COP, for many years to come. And until we actually cap that, then we won't have averted the problem. So we really do see the concern going up for good reason. At the same time, obviously, the second thing that jumps out is the willingness to act and the desire people have for governments and institutions to act. And that is encouraging to me, because over the last 10 years or so, the two things, the economic arguments for rapid cleaning up of our economy, are absolutely off the scale positive. The health arguments and the environmental arguments for acting more urgently and at scale are off the scale again. I mean, just a couple of examples. We went from 40% coal in the UK to pretty much zero in 5 years, a sort of transition that you couldn't imagine, because we had a civil society, a public, that got exercised about climate. We had a set of entrepreneurial business people, investors, far-sighted innovators, and we had a government that set some really clear guidelines and incentives and long-term certainty for new kinds of investment. And we became the biggest offshore wind producer of energy in the world almost overnight. So these kind of switches are because people understand the economics is changing. And as a backdrop to that, we see 8 million people a year dying prematurely from air quality, primarily from fossil fuel energy production and transportation and vehicle emissions and so on. So yeah, I find that the findings are intuitively right. The risks are rising rapidly, and so the concern is rising. The economic and health arguments are absolutely compelling, and I haven't talked about the counterfactual, of not doing this good, clean stuff. That's rising. So people's willingness to act and willingness to be open. And I think then the question, which I might come back to, I'll pause and let me know if you want me to come back to it now or later. But obviously, we then take that as governments and intergovernmental processes into a COP and decide how we work with the public and with businesses and with all levels of government, right down to local communities, to show that we have a Paris Agreement that is working, and that we can get a quantum ratchet of that Paris Agreement, which was such an important framework, but was far short in terms of its ambition by governments. And so we are needing to harness these arguments and harness this public concern, and say to governments, we're no longer in the zone of we'll reduce emissions by 1 or 2% more, here or there, if you do. We're in a world where governments need to actually be competing with each other to go further and faster to grab those opportunities of clean investment in the future. So that transition is incredibly challenging, especially in poor and vulnerable communities. The finance is kind of shaping up in the private sector, but is not yet there either in public or private spaces yet. The adaptation that we need, the resilience we need, is still very poorly understood. And so I can come on to explain some of the work we're doing to really get every country to engage and play their part in ratcheting up and showing that we've got a chance of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees and a chance of supporting the poorest and most vulnerable to be resilient to the terrible challenges they are facing. And that, the way we've basically done that is to set up a net zero commitment into the longer term, and so that we stop contributing to climate. We're getting everyone to commit to net zero as far as we can. We've already got 80% of the world economy, and then we're bringing it back to 2030 and saying, okay, if you're going to go net zero emissions in the longer term, you've got to give us a proper number for 2030 that links to that pathway. And we've got there in some areas. We've still got many countries still to come.
Thank you, Nick. You gave us even more to think about on top of the findings. And I think, there's a couple things you touched on will be great if we can come back to in our question and answer period. To my mind, you are addressing the fact that while there's been a lot of progress in terms of government commitments, 80% is not 100%. So where are we seeing the leadership among different governments? Obviously, the UK is taking it seriously by hosting COP26. Also, just really interesting to hear you talk about that balance of challenge and opportunity and thinking about, is this a moment? And this is really for the audience and to engage with too, is this the moment where we can really scale ambition? I think as you kind of framed it. So really useful thoughts for us to keep in mind as we move through the conversation today. So before we get to the general conversation, I have another privilege, and that is to introduce Helen Mountford, who is the Vice President for Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute. Helen is also the program director for the New Climate Economy Project, which is a flagship initiative of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. That's an international initiative that examines how countries can achieve economic growth while dealing with the risks of climate change. So one of our questions kind of touched on that. And Helen, I would note, just like Nick, also worked at the OECD as part of her career. And I think, Helen, like Nick, really brings a lot of experience, if you don't mind me saying, Helen, in the trenches of policy work and also just trying to think about creatively, how do we make progress on issues that we all seem to care about? So, Helen, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to turn it over to you for your thoughts about what you're seeing in the research that we did at Pew Research Center and how it relates to some of the other considerations you have in mind when you think about the challenge of climate change.
Thanks very much, James, and huge thanks to Jacob and the whole Pew Research Center team that did this excellent work. I think really fascinating results and wonderful to have this up-to-date analysis, really clearly showing that citizens are more willing to take action on climate and are expecting even more from their governments. And I would note these surveys were done before the recent IPCC report released last month, which really was a red alarm from leading scientists to all of us. And it was also before the very dramatic climate impacts we all saw and many of us felt this summer, including record wildfires, heat waves, extreme flooding around the world. And this was all happening at just 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming, as Nick mentioned. So making it very clear that every fraction of a degree matters. So when you see what's happened even since the survey was taken, I wonder if even today the results might be even clearer in terms of the demand from citizens for more action and what they themselves are willing to do. But it's fantastic work and great to have. I'd love to say a little bit about how this now links into what we're seeing play out in terms of political commitments and action around the world. So as of today, we've got 116 countries, which are responsible for just over 50% of global emissions that have actually submitted formally updated 2030 climate targets for what they can do themselves at home. They're so-called NDCs. This updates what they'd committed to do under the 2015 Paris Agreement. Now, of those 116, only about half of them actually reflect greater ambition, higher top level numbers for 2030. That means that about half of them actually don't achieve greater ambition. They just provide more detail, more information on how they'll achieve the existing targets. So that's progress, but it's not yet enough to put us on the right track. We need a lot more action to move us forward to where we need to get to really address climate change together. We're seeing a lot of momentum. Back in December last year, at the end of 2020, when you added up all the commitments that were on the table, the new commitments, it probably put us on track for something like about 2.8 degrees Celsius of warming. So again, not yet where we need to be in 1.5 degrees, but moving in the right direction. Since then, we've seen even more momentum. And actually, later this week at WRI, we'll be releasing a new report which actually assesses some of the most recent commitments and shows how much further they're taking us closer to the target that we want to reach, and in particularly focusing at the role that G20 countries play, both their current commitments, but what more they can do even before COP26 to help close that gap towards a trajectory that is closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So G20 countries, of course, are critical. They're responsible for about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And over half of them have already come forward with net zero commitments, the kinds of which Nick was just mentioning before. So there's an important opportunity there. They can't do it all, but they have a certain role. And I mean, even if you take countries such as India, which is committed to ambitious renewable energy targets, if you lock those into their climate targets, that will help to shift us. Even more importantly, China, the major emitter globally, and one which has really been singled out in the survey results in terms of people watching China to see what China will do and being wary of whether they will step up enough. China at the moment has actually set a commitment to reach net zero by 2060, but has not yet updated their 2030 target to align with that. So I think all eyes are on China, and this survey really shines that especially bright spotlight on China and what it needs to do. In addition to that, I would note one other country that is particularly interesting in some of the results here is, of course, the US. And there's a strong feeling that the US is doing a bad job of handling climate change coming out of the survey. Again, an interesting point is that the survey was applied in early spring this year in many places, just as the new US administration, the Biden-Harris administration, was coming on board. Now, of course, in their first days and weeks, they did a lot to tackle climate change. They quickly reversed and strengthened some of the climate and environmental policies that the Trump administration had rolled back. So already took some action then. But then further in the spring and April, they announced a very ambitious new target for 2030, reducing emissions by 50 to 52% compared with 2005. And then more recently, what they're doing now is trying to get past two important things. One, an infrastructure bill, a major infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Plan, and two, a budget reconciliation package. And together, if these actually are able to go forward, they'll really be able to deliver the kind of climate ambition the US is looking for. So the survey results clearly show people are watching China, they're watching the US, they're looking to see what they'll do, not yet trusting that they'll step up. And I think there's real opportunities for both to do so now. Of course, on the US side, amongst other rich nations, there's also a strong responsibility to step up with climate finance. And that's one of the things we're watching to see whether the US will come forward with more commitments to support developing countries in their ambitions to adapt to the climate impacts that are already hitting and to go towards low carbon economy. So something to watch in the coming weeks for the US to help support that international climate action. And finally, one final point I want to emphasize is really picking up on something that Nick said before. When you look at the way the US has been moving forward over the last few months, the focus has really been here on how climate action can actually create jobs, can boost growth and competitiveness of the economy. So it's a very strong narrative and strong approach from the government, emphasizing these economic and jobs and health benefits and how that can accrue from ambitious climate action. Now, it's interesting that in the survey, the respondents were really divided on this question around economic growth and climate action. About half saying whether they thought these two can go together or whether they're things which would be trade-offs. Now, this is a shift from a few years ago when I'd say most around the world really saw climate action as a cost. But it's not yet a shift significantly enough in terms of recognizing how great the benefits and the opportunities are of climate change. Now that the costs of a lot of the technologies we need have plummeted, now that we're much more aware of the health impacts of going to continuing with a high carbon and polluting economy. So I don't think we've yet gotten that through, as Nick said, the sort of off the scale positive economic and health benefits of climate action. I don't think that message is yet coming through clearly enough based on these survey results. So definitely an area where we need to do more communication and ensure that the evidence of these benefits are clearer in countries around the world to help support more ambitious climate action. But again, thank you so much. Excellent survey, really, really exciting results, and a lot more to delve into.
Thank you so much, Helen. And your comments about that question that we asked, and I'm so glad we asked it, about the benefits of economic benefits of addressing climate change, and the fact that there wasn't, at least in our findings, a sense of a clear narrative, a story about the benefits, and those mixed views. And your comments then, where does that leave us? And again, I think that's a very important point to consider and weigh as researchers, as people who care about the issue. And so I raise that with the audience. We are going to turn to Q&A in just a moment for the audience, and some questions are already coming in, so thank you for that. Please continue to use the submission box at the bottom of your screen to get your voice heard in this conversation. Again, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Helen. To kick things off, could I just throw the same question to each of you and get your quick thoughts on this? And that is, there's talk in both your comments about ambition, momentum. We're talking about governments and citizens and our research, and you are as well. What about leadership? We've kind of touched on it, but just let's talk about governments and their leadership in this international response to climate change. And Nick, I'll ask you to comment first. Where do you think we need that leadership most? Is there a particular country? Because we saw the mixed reviews in different countries. Is it a group of countries? Is it really COP26 is the best vehicle? I just wonder where you see that kind of government leadership on this issue of climate change being most critical and vital. Where do we need it? Where do you see it?
Yeah, well, I'd actually start by going a step back and saying that leadership has to come from everywhere, and that's across all communities in civil society, across business, and in cities and in regions and in subnational governments at all levels. And that's how you really put pressure on leaders of countries and leaders of major international organizations. And all leaders have been tackling COVID for this last 2 years, but there's always something. Look at the moment at the way that various foreign policy issues are dominating. There are always huge domestic issues that are much more unpredictable and are in the immediate electoral cycle. And there's been that risk for a long time that this has felt like an issue that can be pushed out a little bit further down the line. And I think that's where your data showing the level of concern going up is very important. I remember being in DC at the beginning of the Obama administration, and depending how you ask the question, economy, jobs, security, and therefore you could park climate. And what I think we're finding here is that your data is reflecting that people recognize the linkage now between a sustainable environment, a natural world that we are dependent on, a climate that is destabilizing and very deeply alarming at a deep level, and that it's not delinked from the kind of community you want to live in and the kind of economy you want to have and the kind of jobs that might be available. Now, I think to Helen's point, that the challenge for leaders is that it's very hard for people to imagine how bad this is going to get if we don't act. And so anything you say about positivity and the benefits of action, that's what I said about the unquantifiable benefits, because compared to how bad it would be without action, even a status quo would be massively important. But there is a positive story, but because of that challenge, often the positive story it doesn't cut through as the top political issue. So we're obviously hoping that at the UN next week, this will be absolutely top for everybody. And then at the G20, which the Italian government will host at the end of October, the weekend before our COP. And then at COP, the point is that this gets to the top. We're having a huge number of world leaders signing up to COP, which is very important that the signal is sent that they want action and they can see a way through that's beneficial. There is this incredibly hard transition period where you make it work for all communities and you stop small constituencies pulling back the overall push. But that's where leaders come in and say, we've just got to do this. And our Prime Minister has been crystal clear with an industrial plan and an emissions target. And the US have also come with a big target. The final thing, sorry to go on, I'll just say, obviously leadership in the US, China, India, and other big European and G20 countries is the key thing. And we are not there yet, but they need to hear from leaders in small island states, in the poorest countries. More than half the United Nations are poor and vulnerable countries, and that number is going up every day because of the vulnerabilities that are stretching across the planet. So those leaders have got a big equity in saying to others, the G20, that they've got to act.
Thanks, Nick. And Helen, I mean, leadership coming from every sector, every echelon of society, so to speak. We asked people, citizens, individuals, what they're willing to do. They said they're willing to often to take steps. As you think about what people as citizens can be doing that would be most helpful besides taking our surveys, how does that activity at that local level help this overall cause and connect with the kind of big issues that you and Nick are grappling with in terms of institutional commitments?
Thanks very much, James. I think one of the most important things that people can do is vote. Vote for representatives who will actually reflect your future, the future of your children, and what needs to happen to actually avoid some of those really catastrophic potential impacts of climate change. So that's one of the things. I do want to say a few more words on leadership and just picking up on what Nick said. One of the interesting things we saw over the last few years, even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, was that the countries that first stepped up and really came forward with ambitious net zero targets or ambitious enhancement of their 2030 targets was often the small, developing, vulnerable countries. These are the countries who are already on the front lines of climate impacts, and they basically turned around and said, yes, this might require a lot of investment, it might require a lot of change for how we're doing our energy systems, our agriculture, our transport, but we have no choice. The alternative is absolutely untenable, and we're seeing that already, and we can't go that route. So where we've really seen some of the initial leadership was from these vulnerable developing countries. And then they've used that and leveraged it in their discussions with some of the bigger economies, the G20. And we do see the G20 now starting to step up. A number of those countries, and the UK has really stepped up significantly themselves domestically, as well as what they're doing at the international stage. But as Nick said, and I said before, we still have some more to come, right? And we're looking particularly at some countries like China, like the US on the finance side, like India, countries like Mexico and Brazil, which actually announced targets that go backwards. They're less ambitious than their previous ones. So we need more ambition there. I do think the other bit that's quite interesting is the interaction between citizens, between governments, and also with companies, right? And sometimes we call this the ambition loop. As companies start to ramp up what they're doing on climate action, governments feel comfortable and can do more and set more stringent targets because they know the companies will be able to move forward. And then as governments do that, companies and citizens have more confidence and can do more themselves and able to move. So you get this ambition loop. And one of the things that I think has been really exciting in terms of momentum the last couple of months even, is what we've seen in the finance sector. And we now have something like 250 asset owners, asset managers, and banks that together are responsible for assets of more than $80 trillion, which have committed that they will transition their portfolios, their full portfolios, to net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. And they're starting to set the terms and look at how they're going to do that. But you basically have the finance sector turning around and saying, look, it does not work to continue to fund a high carbon pathway. That's not the way the world needs to go. And there are real opportunities by going towards a low carbon, much more resilient economy. And we're going to shift our money that direction. So I think as we see that start to play out, that will in turn influence what governments are able and willing to do. The governments are going to need to shift if they don't have the finance sector behind them. So I think there's some real momentum in terms of other leaders that are stepping up and trying to push forward the agenda.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Nick. I mean, not to overplay the analogy of an ecosystem, but it sounds like we're talking about an ecosystemic response to a ecological challenge and crisis. So we're getting a few questions from the audience, and thank you for that. And again, submission box at the bottom of the stream if you have questions. I want to throw this one first to Jacob, at least start with Jacob, and that is, earlier Helen mentioned, the findings about what publics think about the economic benefits, Jacob, of fighting climate change. And the question is, do we have a sense from our analysis for why we're seeing such discrepancies, even within the EU, that there's not one story people are telling themselves, at least yet, about those economic benefits? Could you give a little context about what those findings mean to you in terms of how you interpreted them? Sorry.
Sure, yeah. And just briefly on leadership, I also want to mention that we have other data that we've collected that has shown that, these same publics were very approving of the US decision to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And that actually helped boost the United States international image and the image of its president in this past year. So you can actually see tangible changes to public opinion when these types of policy decisions are made or policy decisions are reversed. But on the economic standpoint, yeah, I mean, the country that is most likely to say that their economy will benefit from agreements like the Paris Climate Accord are like Sweden, are South Korea, are countries that I think, are generally more positive on their own societies' reactions to climate change and have shown, greater concern over time. So there is a linkage here between those countries where actions have been taken already, or there's more conversations in the public sphere about these issues to say that it will mostly benefit their economy. But as you said, despite that, the mixed views elsewhere, even in places like France and Japan, where, there's been plenty of talk about this, there's still not a sense that, the tangible benefits of climate change will come through is actually happening. I do also want to point out the ideological divides within country do have a role to play there. Those on the left are much more likely to say that any actions to address climate change will benefit their economy, while those on the right are much more likely to say that those actions will harm their economy. So the domestic political coalitions within each of these countries also does make a big deal of difference when it comes to overall public opinion towards climate change. And I think that kind of data does show itself throughout our survey, both on this issue and other issues that are of sort of global import.
If I could stay with you, Jacob, and then turn to Nick and Helen on this next question from the audience, and that is the issue of generations and generational differences, our differences between age cohorts and our data and what we make of that. So first, Jacob, for you, besides the top line findings about generational differences by generation in terms of concern overall about climate change, were there differences in how younger adults versus older adults perceive the performance of the US and China in fighting climate change? Did we take a look at that?
There wasn't much difference actually on those particular questions when it came to age differences. In fact, one of the biggest differences we saw there is that those on the ideological right are actually more positive on the United States dealing with climate change than not. There's also, that when it comes to opinions towards China, we know in our other research too that views towards that country have sort of deteriorated in many of these countries over the past couple years, so that you see a lot of elements where there's not a lot of confidence in the president of China, President Xi. There's not as much favorability towards China itself than there have been in previous years. And on this particular issue, yes, majorities in most of the countries say that China's doing a bad job of dealing with climate change. So those are the kinds of the bigger drivers when it comes to attitudes towards the international community. Young people, though, on the other hand, are willing to say they're more willing to make lifestyle changes in order to deal with climate change. So that action element is more prominent among young people. And from our other research in terms of climate change as a threat, we ask about threats around the world, like economic instability, spread of infectious disease, terrorism, and young people are much more concerned about climate change than they are really those other issues. So it's definitely on the top of young people's minds in the data that we're collecting around the world, whether you ask about it as a threat, a concern, or whether you're willing to make actions or take actions to deal with climate change.
Thanks. And maybe, Nick, I'll throw it to you. I mean, we know in our data, at least, that, younger adults are more concerned about the personal impacts, consequences of climate change for themselves. We've certainly seen in recent years a very youthful protest and a very public voicing of concern about climate change. From your perspective, is that turning into something productive in terms of momentum, having the younger generation apparently more engaged and concerned about this issue of climate change?
Apologies again. Absolutely, yes. The young voice is absolutely critical, and it's getting more and more important, and I think it's impactful. There's also a not insignificant anecdotal evidence of young people are very important leaders, or young people are business leaders, or young people of positions in leadership of having an impact, by the way, more directly through family conversations and so on. So I think the young voice is absolutely critical. What I wanted to also just pick up on in terms of then what young people talk about, there's a lot of concern about laying all of this anxiety and concern on young people. And actually, one thing that I think is quite interesting is the way that a lot of the actions that people are asking for in your data just come from good governance, good regulatory policies, just simple, sensible economics that creates clean environments, clean air, clean investments, and so on. And our energy shift in the UK that I described earlier, it didn't result in higher energy prices. Actually, prices lowered a bit. It didn't result in any insecurity of energy supply, so people didn't mind. It was clean, which people generally preferred. But we were basically able to shift a huge sector without too much concern and engagement on it. Now, what we're all feeling now is that these huge areas of how you move, travel, eat, these are coming much more into people's lifestyle choices. But I would say that, it's important to just adopt all the approaches that work. So you don't have to talk about climate change the whole time. In China, there's very little talk about climate change. There's a lot of talk about air quality, water insecurity, food insecurity, and inequality, and concern about what some of the regions are suffering as they rely on coal in the past and have to transition and so on. So I just make the general point that that we need to do this with our publics, but we've got to just do some good policy that does not need to, in a sense, it doesn't have time to go through too much debate. We've got to though turn also to all those areas of lifestyle that your numbers indicate they're up for a conversation. But I wouldn't just solely say we're doing this for climate change. There's an incredibly wide array of conversations around doing it for our children, doing it for good air, doing it for livable cities, doing it because the jobs are much more rich and numerous and so on. So not to sort of overload the climate dialogue, talk about nature and then species and loss and so forth as well. A final point is just around, as you think about different countries and you talked about different attitudes in different countries, there's also just this huge challenge of us needing to change things at a global level. The truck industry, the car industry, the renewable energy sector, the agriculture sector, these are all deeply global and supply chain dependent industries where we need to be on a common ground. And actually countries run themselves in very different ways. So that's one of the things we're trying to do at COP, is to have a negotiation about country ambition, but to build that ambition by showing that over here there are businesses across country boundaries that want to do the clean stuff and want the new standard and just want certainty. So that's one way to crack through the ambition problem, which is a big one.
So, thanks, Nick. And Helen, I'm just going to change it up a little bit here. Given what Nick just cited and what he touched on, it reminds me of this broader issue of multilateralism or international cooperation. And let's be mindful, right? We all know this because we're all on video. There's a pandemic that's changed the world in a big way. It's also a challenge for international cooperation. So that's part of the context for COP26. In addition to the challenges that were already there, right? This is an international community that has some serious agenda items, right? So in the context of everything that's going on, and given your respective careers looking at kinds of issues, either directly or indirectly related to this challenge of climate change, Helen, I'll turn to you first and then to you, Nick, mindful of time. Just like to get your sense for what is your expectation about COP26? Is it coming at a moment when you're expecting to see real meaningful commitments at COP26? What are your thoughts on what's going to happen at COP26? Not to predict, but kind of what are your expectations more broadly for this moment? Helen?
Thanks very much. That's a big question. Obviously, I think this is an incredibly important moment that COP26 is hitting. Of course, it's been delayed a year, but the timing is really important. We have been going through the pandemic for the last year and a half. I think there was a lot of countries that thought we were about to come out of it and then have been set back. Many others are suffering direly, and we don't really know what the future is. I think this has made everyone aware just how interdependent we are internationally, and if you just look at what's happening with global supply chains now and the disruption, really aware of how interdependent we are and how for any given country, you cannot do it alone. It does not work to vaccinate one country and have the rest of the world not vaccinated. We will not get through this. We need to work together, whether it's on vaccines or climate change or other areas of international cooperation. So, I mean, we're very much hoping that countries and all those coming into COP26 will really view this as a moment where we can step up ambition. And as I mentioned, there's actually been a lot of momentum, and Nick's mentioned a lot of momentum to step up ambition already on climate action, but we need some more. So we step up ambition, but we step up also on solidarity, how to ensure that developing countries in particular, the most vulnerable populations, are brought along, that there is financing, that there's technology support, that there's a real focus on how they can help adapt and build resilience in their economies, and then deal with the losses and damages where we can't even adapt to climate impacts. So ambition, solidarity, and ensuring that for all the world, we're moving towards a world that's more prosperous. And we can do that through climate action, but we need to bring all three of these elements together and really deliver them as a package, with everyone bringing their all to the table in COP26. And that's what we're looking for.
Thanks. And Nick, obviously you are invested in COP26 being a success, as I think most people would agree would be a great outcome. But you're directly involved. And so just before, you were highlighting some ways that would go beyond the simple narrative, climate change is a crisis, we need to address climate change. You mentioned there's other issues that we can talk about that will help that cause. So maybe you could add a little bit of emphasis on what you see as creative opportunities at COP26 coming up. Maybe didn't hear me?
Sorry, my system is frozen. Have you got me back?
Yes, we have you back. So I was just asking, yes, is this a moment, are you being, what are your thoughts about
Apologies.
To expect, but also you were touching on some kind of innovative, creative ways to frame the dialogue. I didn't know if you have any additional thoughts. Oh.
Apologies,
so I'm going to make
dropping at the end. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
So I'll try and say it quickly. Yeah, we have to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So that's the headline. We have to be on track to halve emissions by 2030 and make big inroads into that. We have to support the poorest and most vulnerable countries and finance that. And we have to get the Paris rule book done, the rules of the international multilateral system that can make this happen. The big way that I think we build on the Paris Agreement is that in 2015, it was just governments who could come together and agree the goal. This is about saying governments come and agree the next goal, but they have business and the finance sector and civil society and all other levels of government behind them, pushing them to actually make it all of society where we're all in. So I'm not sure if you heard that or if I was cut off, but I hopefully got that through.
It was all good. Heard you loud and clear, and I really appreciate that. And as we wind down our hour at the webinar, just a couple notes from me. Again, some key concepts shared by our wonderful commentators, Nick and Helen, about the moment we find ourselves in, the scale of ambition that is being contemplated by international actors, as Nick stressed, not just governments, more than governments. I think just based on our survey, the question that we're really putting in front of our colleagues here and in front of the audience, and hopefully everyone who encounters this report, is where are citizens on this question of climate change, at least in these 17 different more higher income economies? Where are they landing on the importance of the issue? What are they willing to do? What do they expect from their own government? And then, as both Helen and Nick stress, not just their own government, what is the international community going to do? And so it's that connection of citizens to elected leaders, citizens to government, and then citizens in the international community. It's really at the focal point of what we do at the Pew Research Center and our Global Attitudes Research, which in this case was led so admirably and effectively by my colleague, Jacob Pauster. So I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to thank Nick Bridge for joining us, Helen Mountford for joining us. And it's just always a pleasure to be working on this kind of an important research with Jacob and other colleagues at the center. Thank you all so much for joining us today and engaging in this important topic and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.